Jerusalem did not experience tragedy in the way the modern world usually defines it. There were no collapsed skylines, no mass evacuations, no scenes of visible chaos broadcast across screens. Yet, in recent days, a chain of unsettling events has quietly disturbed the city in a far deeper way. First came deep, low-frequency sounds and subtle ground vibrations, described by multiple witnesses as rising from beneath the city. Soon after, a brief but abrupt seismic event occurred without warning near the Mount of Olives. And there are other terrifying tragedies that we cannot ignore. Before we continue, hit like to help Jesus' miracles to this message reach others who need to hear it. Deep sounds and unusual vibrations from below. Across multiple areas of Jerusalem, witnesses described the same unsettling phenomenon. Without warning, a deep, resonant sound was felt rather than simply heard, accompanied by subtle but unmistakable vibrations rising from beneath the ground. These sensations were reported by people separated by distance and circumstance, yet their descriptions shared striking similarities. The sound was not sharp or violent. It did not crash, explode, or tear through the air. Instead, it arrived as a low, sustained pressure, described by some as metallic, by others as hollow or horn-like, lingering just long enough to command attention before fading into silence. The vibrations that accompanied it were gentle but present, strong enough to be noticed underfoot, yet not strong enough to cause visible damage. What disturbed many was not fear, but confusion. The phenomenon did not resemble construction work, heavy machinery, aircraft, or traffic, nor did it match the familiar signatures of an earthquake. There was no rolling motion, no escalating tremor, no aftershock. It arrived complete, focused, and then stopped. Equally troubling were the absences. There were no clear seismic confirmations matching the timing and location of the reports. No construction projects or military exercises were scheduled that could account for the sounds. No official explanations emerged that fully aligned with what people experienced. In a city monitored by sensors and cameras, the lack of corroborating data felt as significant as the event itself. The unease did not stem from intensity, but from strangeness. Jerusalem is accustomed to noise, movement, and tension, yet this sound carried a different quality. It felt internal, as if the city itself had briefly exhaled. Ancient stone walls remained standing. Streets stayed intact, and yet something beneath them seemed to have shifted, spoken, or pressed upward. For many residents, the most unsettling moment came after the sound ended. The sudden silence that followed felt deliberate, almost expectant. Conversations paused. Movement slowed. People looked at one another, searching for confirmation that they had not imagined what they felt. The ground had not broken, but it had made itself known. And this was only the first disturbance reported in a sequence that would continue to unfold. If this is worth to you, consider supporting by liking the video and subscribing so we can move on this channel. The epicenter near the Mount of Olives. Preliminary assessments indicated that the strongest point of impact lay near the Mount of Olives, a ridge east of the Old City, long recognized by geologists as structurally vulnerable. The area is composed largely of fractured limestone, layered over centuries of natural cavities, ancient tombs, and carved passageways. From a scientific perspective, it is a place where stress can accumulate quietly and release suddenly. Yet geology alone cannot explain why this location drew such intense attention. The Mount of Olives is not simply another hillside. It is one of the most symbolically charged landscapes in human history. In Scripture, it is repeatedly associated with departure and return, judgment and restoration, mourning and hope. It is the place where prophets spoke, where Jesus taught, prayed, wept, and, according to Christian belief, where he ascended and will one day return. When reports confirmed that the epicenter aligned closely with this ridge, the reaction shifted. What might have been dismissed as unfortunate geology took on a heavier dimension. The event did not strike a random suburb or an industrial zone. It touched ground saturated with memory, expectation, and centuries of prayer. Eyewitness accounts from the Mount of Olives and its surrounding slopes described cracked stone paths, shifted tomb markers, and subtle distortions in familiar walkways. These were not dramatic collapses, but precise disturbances, affecting ancient surfaces more than modern structures nearby. Many modern buildings stood largely unaffected, while older stones showed signs of strain, deepening the sense that something selective had occurred. Engineers pointed to soil composition, construction methods, and the weight of accumulated debris beneath the old city. Their explanations were technically sound. Still, for many observers, they felt incomplete. The question lingered not over how the ground moved, but where it chose to move most clearly. In biblical texts, such as Zechariah 14, the Mount of Olives is described as a place where the ground itself responds to divine presence. Such passages have long been read symbolically. Yet, when fresh cracks trace that same ridge in real time, symbolism begins to feel uncomfortably close to reality. The convergence of geological fragility and prophetic significance transformed this event from a technical anomaly into a moment of reflection. It felt less like chance and more like focus, as if a pressure point long known to history had been pressed once more. And as attention fixed on the Mount of Olives, the implications of what had begun there only grew heavier as events continued to unfold. A sudden quake without warning felt beyond Israel. The shaking arrived abruptly and disappeared almost as quickly as it began. There was no drawn-out buildup, no series of smaller tremors to prepare the population for what was coming. One moment, the city moved through its usual rhythms. The next, the ground shifted beneath feet with enough force to demand attention. Then, just as suddenly, it stopped. What unsettled many was not the level of structural damage, but the absence of warning. Instruments recorded an event that appeared largely complete in a single motion, lacking the familiar sequence that often accompanies seismic activity. For residents, this made the experience feel less like a natural progression and more like an interruption, a sharp jolt that arrived fully formed and then withdrew. The reach of the shaking amplified its impact. Reports soon emerged from outside Israel's borders. Tremors were felt in parts of Cyprus, Lebanon, and Syria, extending the experience across a region shaped by shared fault systems and shared history. A movement that seemed localized on a map revealed itself to be regional in effect, reminding observers that geological boundaries do not align with political ones. This wider resonance transformed the event psychologically. Even where damage was minimal, the knowledge that the same motion had traveled beneath multiple nations created a sense of exposure. It was no longer only Jerusalem reacting to a disturbance. The surrounding region had felt it too, almost simultaneously, as if connected by an unseen network beneath the surface. Historically, such moments have served as reminders that land long regarded as solid can shift without regard for borders, expectations, or preparation. The event did not escalate into open disaster, yet its suddenness and reach altered how many perceived the ground beneath them. And still, this was not the final disturbance reported. Trumpet-like sounds around the old city. In the hours and days following the tremor, reports began to surface from multiple areas surrounding the old city. Witnesses described low, resonant sounds, sustained and metallic in tone, accompanied by a subtle pressure that could be felt more than clearly heard. The sensations were brief, yet distinct enough to interrupt movement and conversation. There were no ceremonies underway, no scheduled drills, no visible instruments, vehicles, or installations that could be identified as the source. The sounds did not resemble sirens, alarms, or industrial noise. They were not sharp or chaotic. Instead, they carried a measured, horn-like quality, lingering just long enough to draw attention before fading. In some accounts, the sound seemed to move through stone rather than air, resonating along walls, alleyways, and ancient structures. What followed was not panic. There were no crowds running or shouting. Instead, people paused. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Some looked toward the Temple Mount, others toward the eastern wall or the surrounding valleys. The shared reaction was stillness, as if the city itself were listening. Officials and experts offered cautious explanations. Low-frequency vibrations, atmospheric conditions, distant mechanical sources, or acoustic illusions caused by narrow stone corridors were all suggested. None were confirmed. No measurements conclusively matched the timing or character of the reports. In a city layered with memory and expectation, even sound becomes part of the message. And by this point, the sequence no longer felt accidental. Biblical reflection. When sound becomes a signal. In Scripture, sound is rarely treated as background noise. Trumpet-like tones appear at moments of warning, transition, and divine attention rather than celebration or spectacle. From Sinai, where the sound of a trumpet grew louder and louder as God's presence descended, to the prophets who described horns calling a people to awaken, sound often marks the boundary between the ordinary and the sacred. The Bible does not present such sounds as explanations in themselves, but as signals. They announce that something is being addressed, not yet completed. In prophetic language, the trumpet does not destroy. It gathers, it warns, it prepares. For those familiar with passages such as Joel and Revelation, trumpet imagery is tied to stages, not endings. Each sound precedes movement. Each call invites attention before action follows. That is why, in Jerusalem, these reports carried weight beyond acoustics. The timing matters. The sound followed the shaking. It did not replace it. In biblical patterns, sound often comes after the ground has already moved, reinforcing that the moment is ongoing, not finished, not resolved. Whether understood symbolically or literally, Scripture frames such moments as invitations to awareness. The call is not to fear, but to listen. Tragedy without ruin. These four tragedies are not defined by casualties, ruined skylines, or scenes of open chaos. They are measured instead by the quiet erosion of certainty. Nothing collapsed in the way modern headlines expect. Life continued. Streets reopened. Yet something beneath the surface shifted, and that shift has lingered. Deep, unplaceable sounds emerged from below ground, carrying no clear source and no immediate explanation. The epicenter of movement aligned with the Mount of Olives, a location where geology and prophecy have always intersected. A sudden quake arrived without warning, reached beyond national borders, and vanished before it could be fully categorized. Then came the trumpet-like sounds, echoing through ancient stone corridors, producing silence rather than panic. Individually, each event might be explained, debated, or dismissed. Together, they form a sequence, not loud enough to force belief, not destructive enough to demand evacuation,